So good day everyone, here is the part 3. So now we're going to discuss the functional anatomy of the brain. So brain is the largest and most complex mass of nervous tissue in the body. No? You have your four major regions that your cerebral hemispheres, the encephalon, brainstem, and your cerebellum.
Welcome to the University of Utah Neuroanatomy Laboratory. We're going to go inside and do some dissections of the brain and look at some of the important structures that are useful for understanding neurological principles and localization. The purpose of neuroanatomy and all of its tortuous tracks is to allow you to do neurological localization. That is to say, decide where in the brain of your patient the disease process is occurring. That's the total reason for most of you to want to understand the connectivity of the brain. Now let's look at the surface of the brain. We've removed the coverings, the leptomeninges, the pia, and the arachnoid, and I want to just show you the different lobes of the brain as an introduction. In addition, on this brain, you can see the brainstem. The brainstem extends from this region where my probe is, a little bit difficult to see, down all the way here to where the spinal cord was attached. In addition, you can see the cerebellum, involved with coordinated motor control, as well as the surface of the cerebral cortex. This is the ventral surface of the brain, and the most prominent feature here is the temporal lobe, which I am outlining. Here is the temporal lobe on the other side, and in front of it is the undersurface of the frontal lobe. Cranial nerves are attached, such as the visual optic nerve and the sensory nerve from the face, the trigeminal nerve, and blood vessels, such as this large basilar artery, are running on the surface. Or you can even see the large internal carotid artery. We will come back and look at the nerves and the arteries and the other connections in greater detail. But I just want to introduce you to the region of the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. And together they make up the brain stem. Let's look at the surface now of the brain and look at the different lobes. You already saw the inferior surface of the temporal lobe coming back to here, and we just kind of arbitrarily draw a line and say that this is approximately the end of the temporal lobe posteriorly and the tip of the temporal lobe anteriorly. And then we look for a sulcus on the surface of the brain. Sulci are these grooves, and the surface structures that are coiled are the gyri. So we have sulci and we have gyri. The gyri have names, but we're not going to learn most of them. However, this major sulcus, the central sulcus, because it runs from the midline all the way down to the lateral fissure, separating it from the temporal lobe, this central sulcus separates frontal lobe in front of it from parietal lobe behind it. And very interestingly, the cortex involved in voluntary movement is in front of the central sulcus, and the cortex involved with primary somatic sensation from your body is the gyrus behind the central sulcus. So this is frontal lobe, this is parietal lobe, this is motor cortex in general, and this is sensory cortex in general. So we're just getting our bearings. The frontal lobe is further sort of divided, and it's hard to see the distinction, but this band along here is the superior frontal gyrus, Then we have the middle frontal gyrus and the inferior frontal gyrus. The motor cortex in front of this precentral gyrus, as we call it, because it's in front of the central sulcus, is an area involved in the left hemisphere, which we're looking at, with the production of speech. And you may have heard of it before. It's called Broca's area. The rest of the frontal lobe is either motor function, planning motor function, or executive functions such as judgment and planning. Let's look at the parietal lobe now. The parietal lobe is separated from the occipital lobe by an arbitrary line that we draw between the parietal and the occipital regions, these little notches here. So if I were to display here, I would say that approximately this is the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is very important in humans because this lobe is involved with visual information processing. It's a wonderful brain that we have, and we are very specialized as humans for visual computation or orientation and analysis. So we have our three lobes: occipital lobe involved with vision, parietal lobe involved with sensation and integration of multiple modes of sensory input, and a frontal lobe with motor and higher order function. And this temporal lobe that is down here is very much involved with auditory information, which is coming into this fissure here that I'm pulling down. This is the lateral fissure, and auditory information, sound, comes to both hemispheres and is processed here. And this area behind it, the superior temporal gyrus, this back part here is involved in the comprehension of language. So you've got two language areas, an interpretive language area and a production language area. And when we study the consequences of cerebral stroke, we'll see that some strokes can knock out one area and you'll have problems producing intelligible speech, while other areas leave you hearing perfectly fine but not understanding what you're hearing, and other lesions or damaging strokes that involve all of this area can leave you with a large deficit, which we call global aphasia. Aphasia is a language disturbance. The temporal lobe, in addition to having an auditory function, has an area underneath this gyrus here, which is required in one hemisphere for forming new memories. It's called the hippocampus, but it's not visible here. So temporal lobe, auditory and new memories; occipital lobe, visual information, processing and recognition; parietal lobe, somatic sensation from the face and the body; frontal lobe, motor execution voluntarily, planning and execution of appropriate judgment and actions. The two hemispheres are not identical, and later we'll talk about special localizations between the hemispheres, but right now I just want to point to the fact that the two hemispheres are held together by a large band of fibers called the corpus callosum. What I have here is a coronal section through the brain. What we've done is we've taken our brain and we've sliced it like through this way, and so this is called a coronal or frontal section. And I'm going to rest it here so that you can see the internal structure of the brain. We'll deal with these in more detail, but right now you can see that those gyri that we were looking at and the sulci, the dips in between, can be easily distinguished, and the gyri are covered with a nice layer beige in color, and that is your gray matter, as we say, of the cerebral cortex. Maybe we should have called it beige matter. And beneath it is a lighter area, which we call the white matter. In general, gray matter consists of cell bodies, both neurons and glia, and white matter are axons. Axons are the processes of neurons either coming to the cerebral cortex or leaving the cerebral cortex and descending to lower brain structures. An example of white matter here is this band of fibers called the corpus callosum. It was that band that held the two hemispheres together. When we were looking down through that interhemispheric fissure, at the base of that was this band of white matter connecting similar areas or homotopic areas of one hemisphere with the other. And this is a way that the right and the left hemispheres can communicate. In addition, they can communicate through structures like this deep area. You notice it's beige, so it's mainly cell bodies, a deep structure called the thalamus. And here we can see the temporal lobe that we were looking at on the surface. Notice here, if I prop this up and pull it down a little bit, you can see that large lateral fissure that we saw on the lateral surface. That means that this is the temporal lobe. You can even see a blood vessel in there. This bit of cortex buried underneath the hemispheric, temporal, and parietal lobes is the insula. We're not going to deal with that, but it does have a name. It's where the cortex got buried as it became more and more convoluted. This is parietal, or it could be motor cortex. I can't tell with an isolated section exactly if we're in the frontal lobe or the parietal lobe. It doesn't really matter. And remember, I told you that one of the functions of the temporal lobe, in addition to the auditory region, was an area involved in memory. That area is called the hippocampus, and it's curled up here right in this medial part of the temporal lobe. The other major structure you see in a cross-section like this, or a coronal section, are these holes in the brain. One here, one here, one here, a little bitty one here, and here. These form part of the ventricle system, which we will explore further, but right now just know that they're filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And the leptomeninges, or the pia and the arachnoid, on the surface, if we can zoom in a little bit, we can see them delicately covering the surface of the brain. The main thing I want you to see on this brain is the brain stem. So this is the cerebellum that we saw before out to the side, and the brainstem, recall, was in the middle. Here we have the brainstem on a mid-sagittal. This is cut in the middle. So this is a mid-sagittal section. Here's a bit of the medulla. Here is the pons with a big basilar artery creeping up over it. And here is the midbrain, often hard to see. And finally, then we have deep structures such as the thalamus. And we can see many of the vessels like the anterior cerebral artery here, as well as spaces such as the ventricular system, which we'll look at in more detail.
So, ayan, your brain is very complex and beautiful. So, ayan, so first is you have your paired cerebral hemispheres, and that's collectively called your cerebrum. That is the most superior part of your brain, and together are a good deal larger than the other three brain regions combined. So, you have your three, ayun na yung tinuro kanina sa video, no? The entire surfaces exhibit elevated ridges of tissue called your gyri. And sinaseparate siya nung parang kanal, no? Parang shallow grooves called sulci. And meron din tayong tinatawag na deeper grooves called your fissures. And those are the ones separating large regions of the brain. Example, you're looking duodenal fissure. Diba? Yun yung nagsaseparate separate ng cerebral hemispheres. So, there are three basic regions. So, first is your superficial cortex of gray matter that looks gray in fresh brain tissue. And you have your internal area of white matter. And you have your basal nuclei, that's islands of gray matter situated deep within the white matter. So, your cerebral cortex, this is for speech, memory, logical, and emotional response, as well as consciousness, interpretation of sensation, and voluntary movement. Those are all functions of the neurons of your cerebral cortex. So, the primary somatic sensory area is located in the parietal lobe posterior to your central sulcus. So, yan. We have what we call a sensory homunculus. This is a spatial map that is used to show how much tissue in the primary somatic area is devoted to various sensory function. So you can Google that one. That's what we call a sensory homunculus. So it will show there that your lips and fingertips, those are the body regions with the most sensory receptors. So, ayan. So, impulses traveling from the body's sensory receptors are localized and interpreted in this area of the brain. So, itong primary somatic sensory area, these are allows you to recognize pain, coldness, or light touch. No? Tsaka, yun yung tinatawag, kita mo yan. Ayan, may picture pala. So, this is what we call the homunculus, the sensory homunculus map. Diba? So, it's scary. So, your visual area, that's located in the posterior part of your occipital lobe, while your auditory area is in your temporal lobe, bordering the lateral sulcus. Your olfactory area, that's found deep inside your temporal lobe, I'm sorry. Yeah, so just be familiar, know what is temporal lobe, what is the occipital lobe. No, when you say occipital lobe, that's for your visual, temporal lobe, auditory, memory, mga ganun. Then, yan. So, we have your primary motor area. So, your primary motor area, this allows us to consciously move our skeletal muscles, and this is anterior to the central sulcus in the frontal lobe. So the axons of these motor neurons form the major voluntary motor tract, the corticospinal or pyramidal tract, which descends to the cord. So, ayan. So most of the neurons control body areas having the finest motor control. That's your face, your mouth, and your hands. So you have also your motor homunculus, the body map on the motor cortex. Yan. So your Broca's area, this is a specialized cortical area that is very involved in our ability to speak. It's found at the base of the precentral gyrus, and damage to this area causes inability to say words properly. We have your anterior association area. These are areas involved in higher intellectual reasoning and socially acceptable behaviors. It's in the anterior part of your frontal lobes, and complex memories appears to be stored in the temporal and frontal lobes. Yan. So, diba? May areas ng brain mo. Like this one, it's Broca's area. This is for your motor and speech. So, pag na-damage yan, yung area na yan, no, meron, nagkakaroon ng paghirap ng pagsasalita, mga ganun. Then, ayan, sa speech mo dito, visual area, yan. So, just be familiar with all of those. So your posterior association area, that's the part of your posterior cortex. They play a role in recognizing patterns and faces, and blending several different inputs into an understanding of the whole situation. Your speech area is located in the temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes. So the speech area allows you to sound out words. This area, like Broca's area, is usually in only one cerebral hemisphere. So the frontal lobes houses areas involved with language, comprehension, or word meanings. So your cerebral white matter, most of the remaining cerebral hemisphere tissue composed of fiber tracts carrying impulses to from or within the cortex. Your corpus callosum, no? This is one very large fiber tract connects the cerebral hemispheres, and those fiber tracts are called commissures. So they are just above the structures of the brainstem and allows the cerebral hemispheres to communicate with one another. So yan, your basal ganglia, these are several islands of gray matter buried deep within the white matter of the cerebral hemispheres. And they help regulate voluntary motor activities by modifying instructions sent to the skeletal muscles by the primary motor cortex. Your internal capsule, these are tight band of projection fibers that passes between the thalamus and the basal nuclei. Your interbrain is sits atop the brainstem and is closed by the cerebral hemispheres. Your major structures, we have your thalamus, your hypothalamus, and your epithalamus. Your thalamus, this encloses the shallow third ventricle of your brain, and they relay station for sensory impulses passing upward to the sensory cortex. So, ito yung nag-recognize if whether the sensation we are about to have is kung pleasant ba or unpleasant. So, yan. Your hypothalamus is makes up the floor of your diencephalon. Ito yung nagpe-play ng role in the regulation of body temp, water balance, metabolism. And this is a center for many drives and emotions. So, ito yung tinatawag na emotion visceral brain. Sila din kasi yung nag-regulate ng pituitary gland mo, yung endocrine organ. And they can also produce two hormones of its own. So, yung pituitary gland, they hang from the anterior floor of the hypothalamus by a slender stalk. I'm sorry. And then you have your mammillary bodies. It's a reflex centers involved in the olfaction, sense of smell, and it bulges from the floor of the hypothalamus posterior to the pituitary gland. So, your epithalamus, they form the roof of your third ventricle. You have your pineal gland that's still part of your endocrine system, and your choroid plexus of the third ventricle. These are knots of capillaries within each ventricle form the CSF. Your brainstem, the structures there are your midbrain, your pons, and your medulla oblongata. So they provide a pathway for ascending and descending tracks. They have many small gray matter areas, and these nuclei produce the rigidly programmed autonomic behaviors necessary for survival. No? And this is very important. It's associated with cranial nerves and control vital activities such as your breathing and your blood pressure. So your midbrain extend from the mammillary bodies to the pons inferiorly. You have your cerebral aqueduct. These are tiny canals that travels through the midbrain, and it connects the third ventricle of the encephalon to the fourth ventricle below. You have your cerebral peduncles, little feet of the cerebrum. These are two bulging fiber tracts which convey ascending and descending impulses. Your corpora quadrigemina, these are four-rounded protrusions that is dorsally located bulging nuclei. Next is we have your pons. These are rounded structure that protrudes just below the midbrain. It means bridge and mostly fiber tracts. And they have important nuclei involved in the control of breathing. So, yan, yung mga control, ito, mga importante kasi yan na malaman natin. So, medulla oblongata. Now, this is the most inferior part of the brainstem, and it merges into the spinal cord below. So, important fiber tract area where the important pyramidal tracts cross over to the opposite side. So, pagpaparalan mo pa yan super deep, it's very complicated, but it's also very important. So, it contains many nuclei that regulate vital visceral activities. It contains centers that control heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, swallowing, and vomiting. And your fourth ventricle lies posterior to the pons and medulla and anterior to the cerebellum. So, you have your reticular formation. So, this extends to the entire length of the brainstem. Merong diffuse mass of gray matter na tinatawag nating reticular formation. So, the neurons of the reticular formation are involved in the motor control of your visceral organs. So, there's a special group of reticular formation neurons called the reticular activating system. And they play a role in your consciousness in the awake and sleep cycle. The RAS also acts as a filter for the flood of sensory inputs that streams up the spinal cord and brainstem daily. So those weak or repetitive signals are filtered out, but unusual strong impulses do reach consciousness. So damage to this area can cause coma. Next is your cerebellum. This is a large cauliflower-like cerebellum that projects dorsally from under the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. So like the cerebrum, the cerebellum has two hemispheres and a convoluted surface. And it has also an outer cortex made up of gray matter and an inner region of white matter. So the cerebellum, they provide a precise timing for skeletal muscle activity and controls our balance and equilibrium. Because of its activity, body movements are smooth and coordinated, and it plays its role less well when it's sedated by alcohol. So fiber reach the cerebellum from the equilibrium apparatus of the inner ear, the eye, the proprioceptors of your skeletal muscle and tendons, and many other areas. So, yung cerebellum mo, pwede siyang, no, para siyang automatic pilot. No? And, kaysa naman yung, ni mo monitor niya yung, um, ano ba yan? Your cerebellum can be compared to an automatic pilot. And, oh my God. Wait. Galit ang langit. Continuously comparing the brain's intentions with the actual body performance by monitoring body position and amount of tension in various body parts. So when needed, no, yung cerebellum mo, they send message to initiate appropriate corrective measures. So yan. So pag na-damage yung cerebellum, the movements become clumsy and disorganized, and that's a condition called your ataxia. No, the patients cannot keep their balance, para silang lasing because of the loss of the muscle coordination. Yan. So let's go to the protection of your CNS. So your nervous tissues, they are very soft and delicate, and yung mga irreplaceable neurons na yan are injured even by the slightest pressure. So kaya nga yung, 'di ba, parang ang ganda pagka-disenyo ng body natin, no? There is a protection in your brain and spinal cord by enclosing them within the bone. That's your skull, your vertebral column, meron din mga membranes, meron mga CSF, and lalo sa lahat yung, yung tinatawag natin blood-brain barrier. So, yung blood-brain barrier, napaka-importante nun because they provide protection from harmful substances in your blood. So, there are three connective tissue membranes covering and protecting the CNS structures. So, the outermost layer, no, that's the leathery dura mater. It means tough or hard matter. It's a double-layered membrane where it surrounds the brain. So one of its layers is attached to the inner surface of the skull, forming the periosteum. So the other, called the meningeal layer, they form the outermost covering of the brain and continues as a dura mater of the spinal cord. So the dural layers are fused together except in three areas where they separate to enclose dural venous sinuses that collects venous blood. Next is your web-like, your middle arachnoid matter. So means arachnida means spider. So meron kasi siyang mga thread-like extension to span the subarachnoid space, no? Yung subarachnoid space niya, it's filled with cerebrospinal fluid, no? Ayan. So, ang innermost membrane naman is yung tinatawag natin na pia mater or gentle matter because it is very delicate and clings tightly to the surface of the brain and spinal cord following every fold. So, pag may inflammation ng mga meninges na yan, yun yung tinatawag natin na meningitis. No, this is a very serious threat to the brain because it can be bacterial or viral and it may spread to the nervous tissue of the CNS. So, we diagnose this by taking a sample from the CSF. Ayan, pag nakaka-receive kayo ng sample sa lab na CSF. Meron ding encephalitis or inflammation of the brain. So your cerebrospinal fluid, this is a watery broth similar in its makeup to blood plasma. However, they contain less protein and more vitamin C, and its ion composition is different. So it's continually formed from the blood by the choroid plexuses. These are clusters of capillaries hanging from the roof in each of the brain's ventricles. They form a watery cushion that protects the fragile nervous tissue from blows and other trauma. So your CSF is continually moving and they circulate from two lateral ventricles. No, the two lateral ventricles in your cerebral hemisphere and into the third ventricle in your diencephalon. No. And then through the cerebral aqueduct in the midbrain into the fourth ventricle, dorsal to the pons and medulla oblongata. Ayan. Meron ng visual aid. So, CSF is produced by the choroid plexus of each ventricle. Yung CSF na yan, nagfo-flow through the ventricles and into the subarachnoid space via the median and lateral apertures. And some CSF naman, they flow through the central canal of the spinal cord. Then CSF flows through the subarachnoid space. And then CSF is absorbed into the dural venous sinuses in the arachnoid villi. So hydrocephalus, no, that's literally water on the brain. So that's the case where in the CSF accumulates and they exert pressure on the brain. So sa mga newborn baby, it causes the head to enlarge as the brain increases in size. So pag sa adults naman, this will likely result in brain damage. So we can treat this surgically by inserting a shot, no, to drain the excess fluid into the vein in the neck or into the abdomen. So next is we have your blood-brain barrier. So your blood-brain barrier, neurons are kept separated from blood-borne substances by the blood-brain barrier. And these are composed of the least permeable capillaries in the whole body, almost seamlessly bound together by tight junctions all around. So only water, glucose, and essential amino acids pass easily through the walls of these capillaries. So the bulbous feet of the astrocytes clinging to capillaries may contribute to the barrier, but the relative impermeability of the brain capillaries is most responsible for providing these protection. So this is useless against fats, respiratory gases, and other fat-soluble molecules that diffuse easily through all plastic membranes, and it's designed like that, not to protect your brain. So brain dysfunctions. First is we have TBI or your traumatic brain injury. So first is we have your concussions. So this occurs when brain injury is slight lang. So yun nahihilo, yung tinatawag nilang may nakikita ka bang stars, yun na, or they lose consciousness briefly, no? And there is little permanent brain damage, but typically little permanent brain damage. Brain contusion, meron ng marked tissue destruction. So, yung cerebral cortex mo, meron ng injury, pero pwede naman conscious yung patient. So, pag severe na yung brain contusions, no, pwede na magkakaroon ng coma lasting from hours to a lifetime. So, pag natamaan yung ulo mo, no, pag may traumatic brain injury, ang namamatay yung mga pasyente, it can be from the intracranial hemorrhage, no, nag-rupture yung mga brain vessels mo, or nagkakaroon ng cerebral edema. No. That cerebral edema is swelling of the brain due to inflammatory responses to those injuries. Next is we have your cerebrovascular accident that's commonly called your stroke. So this occurs when the blood circulation to a brain area is blocked as by a blood clot or a ruptured blood vessel and the vital brain tissue dies. So hemiplegia, that's what we call one-sided paralysis. Aphasia is a common result of damage to the left cerebral hemisphere where the language areas are located. Motor aphasia pag may damage to the Broca's area. And sensory aphasia naman if they lose the ability to to understand written or spoken language. TIA TIA is what we call those temporary brain ischemia or restriction of blood flow that lasts from 5 to 15 minutes and are characterized by symptoms such as numbness, temporary paralysis, and impaired speech. So, we have your terrible 3. Ito yung tinatawag natin na terrible 3, your Alzheimer's disease, your Parkinson's disease, and your Huntington's disease. Ayan. So, your Alzheimer's disease, this is a progressive degenerative disease of the brain that ultimately results in dementia or mental retardation. So, yung mga patients, they exhibit memory loss, no? Particularly for recent events. They have short attention span and disorientation and eventual language loss. So, this is associated with shortage of acetylcholine, no, yung neurotransmitter. And with structural changes in the brain, pwede naman, particularly involved in areas para sa thought and memories. Yung mga gyros nag-shrink, yung brain nag-atrophy, meaning because of a certain factor, lumiliit yung mga cells, ganun. Parang mura siyang huyos, ana. So, microscopically, no, patients, microscopically, brain of Alzheimer's disease patients reveals senile plaques. So, there is aggregation of your beta amyloid peptide. So, littering the brain like shrapnels between the neurons. So, ito yung mga tiny peptides na ito yung nagda-damage by enhancing calcium entry into the certain brain tumors. So there's also a protein called tau which appears to bind molecule microtubule tracks together in the brains of Alzheimer's disease victim. I think this is a board exam recall para dito sa board review. Yung protein called tau which appears to bind microtubule tracks together in the brains of Alzheimer's disease patients. So, tau grabs into other tau molecules forming spaghetti-like neurofibrillary tangles within neuron cell bodies. So, yung mga present dogs natin, they ease symptoms by inhibiting yung pag-breakdown ng acetylcholine. Kasi nga may shortage ng acetylcholine. So, ang ginagawa na lang is ini-inhibit yung pag-breakdown ng acetylcholine para meron pa ring stock. Next is your Parkinson's disease. So, your Parkinson's disease, this is a basal nuclear problem. This results from degeneration of specific dopamine-releasing neurons of the substantia nigra of the midbrain. So, afflicted individuals have a persistent tremor at rest, no, exhibited by head nodding and a peel rolling movement of the fingers. So, L-Dopa, it's a drug which is converted to dopamine in the brain, helps alleviate some of the symptoms. Next is we have your Deprenyl. This is a newer treatment drug. No, when given early in the disease, they slow the breakdown of dopamine, which decreases the rate of neurological deterioration to some extent and delays the need to administer L-Dopa up to 18 months. Deep brain thalamic stimulation via implanted electrodes, helpful in alleviating tremors. Your intrabrain transplant of embryonic substantia nigra tissue, this is more promising for long-term results. This is genetically engineered adult nigral cells or dopamine-producing cells from fetal pigs, and all these have produced some regression of these symptoms. Your Huntington's disease, this is a genetic disease that strikes during middle age, no, and leads to massive degeneration of the basal nuclei and later ng cerebral cortex. So its initial symptoms in many are yung parang wild, jerky, and almost continuous flapping movements called chorea, no? Kung titingnan mo siya, mura siya gituyo pero dili, no? So later naman sa disease, no, nagkakaroon na ng mental deterioration. So just note that the signs and symptoms of Huntington's disease are opposite of those of your Parkinson's. So your Parkinson's, there is overstimulation rather than inhibition of your motor drive. So ayan. So sa Huntington's, nagbibigay tayo ng enhance ng dopamine's effects. So next is your spinal cord. So your spinal cord, this is approximately 17 inches long. It's a glistening white continuation of the brainstem. And the spinal cord provides a two-way conduction pathway to and from the brain, and it is a major reflex center. So enclosed within the vertebral column, the spinal cord extends from the foramen magnum of the skull to the first or second lumbar vertebra, where it ends just below the ribs. So like the brain, your spinal cord is cushioned and protected by meninges. So your meningeal coverings do not end at the second lumbar vertebra, but instead they extend well beyond the end of the spinal cord in the vertebral canal. So ayan. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, no, arising from the cord and exit from the vertebral column to serve the body areas close by. The spinal cord is about the size of a thumb for most of its length, but it's obviously enlarged in the cervical and lumbar regions where the nerves serving the upper and lower limbs arise and leave the cord. Yan, galit ang langit. So, your vertebral column, they grow faster your spinal cord. So, yung spinal cord, hindi naman talaga nag-reach ng end ng vertebral column. No. So, your gray matter of the spinal cord and spinal roots. So, this looks like a butterfly or the letter H in cross-section. They surround the central canal of the cord, which contains CSF. So, they have two posterior projections, your dorsal or posterior horns, and two anterior projections, your ventral or anterior horns. So, your dorsal horns, they contain interneurons, cell bodies of the sensory neurons whose fibers enter the cord by the dorsal root and are found in a large area called the dorsal root ganglion. So if damaged, sensation from the body area serves will be lost. Your ventral horns, they contain cell bodies of motor neurons of the somatic or voluntary nervous system, and they send their axons out the ventral root of the cord. So your dorsal and ventral roots fuse to form your spinal nerves. The white matter of your spinal cord, these are composed of myelinated fiber tracts, and some running to higher centers, some traveling from the brain to the cord, and some conducting impulses from one side of the spinal cord to the another. Because of the irregular shape of the gray matter, the white matter in each side of the cord is divided into three regions. That's your dorsal, lateral, and ventral columns. So a patient can have flaccid paralysis when there is damage to the ventral root because the nerve impulses do not reach the muscles affected. So we have also spastic paralysis if the spinal cord is transected or crushed. The affected muscles stay healthy because they are still stimulated by spinal reflex arcs, and movement of those muscles does occur, but movements are involuntary and not controllable. So your PNS, they consist of nerves and scattered groups of neuronal cell bodies found outside the CNS. So we have already considered one type of ganglion. That's the dorsal root ganglion of the spinal cord. Yeah, so structure of your nerves. So as we noted earlier in this chapter, a nerve is a bundle of neuron fibers outside the CNS. So within a nerve, there's neuron fibers or processes wrapped in protective connective tissue coverings. Each fiber is surrounded by delicate connective tissue sheath called your endoneurium. So groups of fibers are bound by a coarser connective tissue wrapping the perineurium to form fiber bundles or fascicles. Finally, all the fascicles are bound together by a tough fibrous sheath called the epineurium to form the cord-like nerve. Like neurons, nerves are classified according to the direction in which they transmit impulses. So nerves carrying both sensory and motor fibers are called mixed nerves. So all spinal nerves are mixed nerves, nerves that carry impulses towards The CNS only are called sensory or afferent nerves, whereas those that carry only motor fibers are motor or efferent nerves. So your cranial nerves is very important. You have 12 pairs of these. These primarily serve the head and neck, and yung vagus nerves yung nag-extend to the thoracic and abdominal cavities. So it's numbered in order, and in most cases their names reveal the most important structures they control. So most cranial nerves are mixed nerves, your optic, your olfactory, and vestibular nerves. So you have 31 human spinal nerves formed by the combination of your ventral and dorsal roots. So although each of the cranial nerves issuing from the brain is named specifically, the spinal nerves naman are named for the region of the cord na they arise. So, ayan. Okay, next is your autonomic nervous system. This is also called the involuntary nervous system. It's the motor subdivision of the PNS. This controls body activities automatically. It's composed of a special group of neurons that regulate cardiac muscle, your heart, your smooth muscles found the walls of visceral and blood organs and glands. It's a relative stability of our internal environment depends largely on the working of the ANS. So, ayan, your sympathetic and your parasympathetic division. Excuse me. So, on our previous discussion of nerves in the efferent division of the PNS, we have focused on the somatic nervous system. And the PNS, ito yung nagko-control ng ating skeletal muscles. Yan, grabe. So you have sa autonomic nervous system naman, they have two arms, your sympathetic and your parasympathetic. So yan lang munang kailangan yung malaman na they have sympathetic and parasympathetic. Ayan, so parasympathetic is also called the craniosacral division. No? Neurons send their axons out in cranial nerves to serve the head and neck organs. Then yung sacral naman dito, leave this and form your pelvic splanchnic nerves which travel to the pelvic cavity. Yan, your sympathetic, that's your thoracolumbar. Just remember your parasympathetic, it's craniosacral. Craniosacral. Your sympathetic naman is thoracolumbar. Yan. So, autonomic functioning. So, body organs served by the ANS receive fibers from both divisions. So, your parasympathetic fibers called cholinergic fibers, they release acetylcholine, while your sympathetic postganglionic fibers called adrenergic fibers, they release epinephrine. Yan. Saan na yun? Yan. So, your sympathetic, this one, ito, dapat nyo itong malaman at this level. Your sympathetic division, this is referred to as a fight or flight system. So, this is evident when we are excited for ourselves in emergency or threatening situation, no? Pag doon tayo sa mga emergencies, mga ganon. So, ayan, pounding heart, rapid, deep breathing, cold, sweaty skin, a prickly scalp, and dilated eye pupil. So, kintahay pag nagalakaw ka sa kalsada, yung feeling mo dangerous to na kalsada, diba? So, na-activate ang fight or flight system mo. That's your sympathetic division. So, ayan, nagpa-pound yung heart mo, diba? Nagda-dilate yung pupils mo. So, actually, yan, nag-increase na yung heart rate mo, your blood pressure, and blood glucose level. Then, nagda-dilate yung bronchioles mo sa lungs, no? Kasi, bale yung body mo, pagka-explain kasi sa akin, ang body mo, they prioritize yung mga important organs na need mo to survive, no? And then, to parang you have what it takes, no? Pinaprioritize na yung what you should have to yun, to basically fight or flight. So, ayan. Yan, so nagda-dilate yung blood vessels mo para makatakbo ka, no? So, ayan. Yung mga manifestations din nito, makikita mo sa digestive organs, 'di ba? Nagwi-withdraw yung blood doon kasi hindi naman priority na pag may emergency na mag-digest ng food. So, ayan, merong withdrawal of blood from the digestive organs. Wait, hanapin ko yung notes na yan. Sympathetic. Ayan, so, meron ba dito? Ay, andito pala. Ayan, so your parasympathetic division, this is called your resting and digesting system. So this is the housekeeping system of the body, diba? It's very opposite. So this is most active when the body is at rest and not threatened naman in any way. So yung concern nito is to promote normal digestion, elimination of feces and urine, conserving body energy, particularly by decreasing demands on your cardiovascular system. So your parasympathetic division, no, chill, para pang housekeeping naman sa katawan mo. So, ayan, may digestion, fortification, diuresis, urination division. Pero pag nasa emergency can feel ng body mo na kailangan mo ng fight or flight system, no? So ayan, exercise, excitement, emergency, and embarrassment division. So, ayan, sympathetic na dilate ang pupils mo, nag-increase ang heartbeat mo, ganun. And nag-inhibit ng activity ng yung gastrointestinal system. Yan, so nag-relax din ang bladder mo. Bakit kailangan mo ba umihi in emergency, gano'n. Mga gano'n. Then, homeostatic imbalance. First is your cerebral palsy. So, in difficult deliveries, nagkakaroon ng temporary lack of oxygen, no? Dahil may nahihirapan ipaanak ang baby. So, nagkakaroon ng neuromuscular disability in which the voluntary muscles are poorly controlled and spastic because of the brain damage. So, half of these victims have seizures, they are mentally retarded, and have impaired hearing or vision. Your anencephaly is the failure of your cerebrum to develop, and this results in a child who cannot hear, see, or process sensory inputs. Your spina bifida, ayan, forked spine, results when the vertebrae form incompletely, typically in your lumbosacral region. So, yung bata, hindi niya nakokontrol yung pag-ihi niya, pagdumi-dumi niya, and the lower limbs are paralyzed. Next is your orthostatic hypotension. This is type of low blood pressure resulting from changes in body position, like yung mga older patients, di ba? Medyo comatose kanila tuwing tumatayo sila kagad, nahihilo sila. So, we can prevent this, no, by sasabihin natin, tay, kung tatayo man tayo galing pagkakahiga or galing sa pagkakaupo, dahan-dahan lang sa pagtayo. So that will give the sympathetic nervous system a little more time to adjust and react. And that's it for your nervous system. Thank you, Ma'am Anne Shimar, for the PowerPoint.